Commander Elena Vance stood in the center of the panicked Orion assembly, her eyes as cold as deep space, and whispered, "We'll handle this." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the breath from 300 different species. Is the arrival of the Terrans a salvation or a new kind of eclipse? To see how the galaxy's soul begins to shift, you should subscribe before we go any further. Now, let's look at the desperation that led us to this moment. 4 standard cycles earlier, the only sound in the Alari embassy had been the soft, rhythmic clicking of Lyra's cooling datapad. Lyra, the Alari emissary, watched the holographic maps of her home sector turn a bruised, oily purple. Every flicker represented a Krell hegemony fleet moving with a surgical, joyless cruelty. They didn't just conquer, they erased. When the assembly met, Lyra stood before the High Arbiters, her fingers trembling as she clutched a small fractured memory crystal. It was a shard from the great library of Alara Prime, a jagged piece of light that held the songs of her ancestors, now half smothered by the soot of orbital bombardment. The assembly members leaned back in their cushioned pods. They spoke of treaties and non-aggression pacts while the Krell burned nurseries. They called the Krell honorless and brutal. Yet their sympathy offered no shields. The hegemony is a tidal wave. One arbiter sighed, his many eyes averted from the crystal in Lyra's hand. "We cannot stop the sea." "Then call the ones who live in the depths," a voice whispered from the back of the hall. The suggestion sent a shiver through the room. Terra, a world of high gravity and higher casualties. A species that had spent its infancy trying to go extinct and its adolescence perfecting the art of preventing it. To call the Terrans was to invite a predator into a house of prey. Lyra looked at the shard of her world. The Krell were not just taking land. They were taking the past. She stepped forward and formally invoked the request for intervention. The Arbiters warned her that humans were monsters who would change the galaxy's soul. Lyra only thought of the children on the transport ships. The response was not a transmission. It was a tear in reality. I've seen many fleets transition from warp, but the Terran arrival felt less like a maneuver and more like an appetite. 47 light years in 3 days isn't a miracle. It's a hunger for distance that defies physics. If you want to witness what happens when that hunger turns toward the Krell, subscribe to Follow the Hunt. The Terran vessels didn't hum with the melodic energy of Alari ships. They thrummed with a low, bone-deep vibration that made Lyra's crest ache. When the airlock cycled open, Commander Vance stepped out. She didn't wear medals or ceremonial silk. She wore charcoal gray plating scuffed by vacuum and grit. Vance met Lyra in a private chamber. The commander remained perfectly still, her face a mask of terrifying efficiency, until Lyra reached out with the fractured memory crystal. As Lyra described the Krell's systematic destruction of the Alari schools, the way they targeted the cultural heart before the military spine, Vance's eyes changed. The coldness didn't leave, but it sharpened into a point. "They are targeting the records?" Vance asked, her voice low. "The art? The young? They say it is to ensure we never rise again," Lyra whispered. Vance looked at the shard. Her hand, calloused and scarred, hovered near the light. "There are 2 types of monsters in the dark," she said, finally looking Lyra in the eye. "Those who hunt the weak, and those who hunt the hunters." The Terran fleet didn't engage in the grand, sweeping maneuvers of the Orion Assembly's tactical manuals. They didn't broadcast challenges or demand surrender. Instead, they simply began to haunt. From the observation deck of the Alari flagship, Lyra watched the sensor feeds as the Krell hegemony's capital ship's massive, brutalist slabs of black iron started to vanish. There were no flashes of antimatter, no debris fields of twisted metal, just a sudden, terrifying absence. The Terrans were ghosts in the machinery, slipping through the Krell's sensor nets like smoke through a screen. Vance had told the assembly they would handle it, and the handling looked less like a war and more like an exorcism. Reports began filtering back to the Alari from deep within hegemony space. The Krell High Command was screaming into the void, their communications hijacked by Terran signal thieves. Every screen on every Krell world didn't show propaganda. It showed the footage of the Alara Prime nurseries. It showed the burning libraries. The Terrans weren't just fighting the Krell military, they were dismantling the Krell's belief in their own supremacy. They aren't firing, Lyra noted, her voice trembling as she watched a Krell dreadnought shut down its own engines and drift, its crew refusing to fight an enemy they couldn't see, but whose judgment they could feel. The Krell speak the language of violence. Vance's voice crackled over the comms, devoid of triumph, but the Wardens are its native poets. We're just reminding them of the verses they wrote. The collapse was total. Within 72 hours, the hegemony of force that had terrified 1,000 systems formally surrendered. They didn't surrender to the assembly. They surrendered to the silence of the Terran fleet. And now, in the tribunal hall, under the silence of 300 species, the outcome was revealed. The Terrans didn't ask for tribute. They didn't claim the Krell's rich mineral moons or the Ilari's gas giants. Vance stood before the High Arbiters one last time. "We didn't come for your gold or your stars," she said, her gaze sweeping over the gathered diplomats who had watched the Ilari burn. "We came because you forgot how to be human." The assembly fell quiet as she turned to leave. The Terrans didn't stay to govern. They didn't stay to be thanked. They simply moved back to their ships with that same predatory, unsettling grace. Lyra walked through the skeletal remains of the great library on Alara Prime weeks later. The air still tasted of old ash, but the silence was no longer heavy. Near a pile of fallen marble, she found a Terran engineer. The human's hands were thick, scarred and covered in the dust of reconstruction. The engineer didn't look up as Lyra approached. He was focused on the fractured memory crystal Lyra had carried to the assembly, the jagged shard of Ilari history. With a precision that seemed impossible for someone built for war, he used a handheld sonic welder to fuse the broken pieces back together. He set the repaired crystal into a new pedestal. The light inside it flared, no longer a jagged spark of grief, but a steady, warm glow that illuminated the ruins. "The hunt is over," the engineer murmured, his voice rough. He gathered his tools and walked toward the waiting shuttle, leaving the restored light behind. Lyra watched the Terran fleet burn for the jump point, heading back into the dark sectors to resume their watch. The galaxy had a new proverb now, whispered by those who lived in the light because of those who stayed in the shadows. "Call the Wardens." The repaired crystal stood alone in the center of the hall, casting a long, unbroken shadow across the floor. Does the presence of the Wardens make the galaxy safer, or just more afraid of the dark? Subscribe to see what happens when the next monster emerges from the void tomorrow.